The air tasted of burnt parchment and rendered human fat when I first understood what we had become. I was standing in the archive sublevel, watching clerk tertiary Voss feed children into the incinerator, and the smell made my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth like I'd licked a crematorium floor. The children weren't dead yet. That was the problem Voss was solving. I had been an archival subordinate for 11 years before the siege reached the inner districts. 11 years of logging requisition forms, death certificates, tithe assessments, supply manifests. 11 years of believing the work mattered because the administratum said it mattered, because the great mechanism of empire required every screw to turn in its appointed groove. I was good at my work, meticulous. I caught discrepancies in grain shipments that would have starved 17,000 people 3 hive levels down. I found a transcription error that would have sent an entire regiment to the wrong continent. Small things, necessary things, things that let me sleep at night in my 2-meter square hab cell, knowing I had value. The enemy, we were never told their name, only that they were heretics, traitors, the usual liturgy of condemnation, broke through the outer walls on a Tuesday. I know because Tuesday was when we processed personnel transfers, and I was halfway through Form 7734G Delta when the first shells hit the upper city. The building shook. Dust fell from the ceiling in veils. Clerk Principal Hadrosian stood up from his desk, adjusted his spectacles, and told us to continue working. The walls were thick here, he said. Archival Section 47 had survived 3 previous sieges. Our duty was to the records. We worked through the shelling, through the screaming that filtered down through 18 meters of rockcrete and steel. Through the day, the Medicaid district caught fire and the smoke turned the sky the color of a bruise that would never heal. I logged death certificates. Hundreds, then thousands. The names blurred together. I developed a tremor in my right hand from writing so quickly. Hadrosian brought us protein paste and recaf and told us we were heroes. Not the kind who died gloriously on walls, he said, but the kind who made sure the administratum knew exactly how many had died gloriously on walls, so their widows might receive their death pensions in 17 to 30 months, pending review. The water stopped on day 9, the power failed on day 12. We worked by candlelight, conserving the promethium for the emergency generators that kept the archive climate controlled. Documents were more fragile than people, Hadrosian reminded us. People could be replaced. A lost census record for Sector 447G3 could never be reconstructed. Think of the cascading failures. Think of the tithe assessments that would propagate errors for generations. Think of our duty. I thought of my duty. I tried not to think about the smell. It changed on day 16. A Vox transmission crackling through the emergency channel. Evacuation protocols for essential personnel. I felt something flutter in my chest. Hope, maybe, or just the spasm of a muscle that had forgotten what hope felt like. Hadrosian gathered us in the central nave of the archive. 47 clerks, scribes, archivists. We stood among the shelves that reached up into darkness, metal racks holding 3,000 years of meticulously maintained bureaucratic memory. This section alone contained 17 million documents. Births, deaths, tithes, crimes, punishments, the dry statistical residue of billions of lives. Essential personnel, Hadrosian said, meant archival staff. The administratum had authorized extraction, but, and here his voice took on the careful, measured tone I'd heard him use when explaining why a form had to be redone in its entirety because of a single transposed digit. The transport capacity was limited. The void ship could carry either 47 people and no cargo, or 3 essential staff and 800 kilograms of priority documents. He gave us 30 seconds to volunteer to stay. Nobody moved. I remember that silence, the way it pressed against my eardrums like the air pressure had changed. Somewhere above us, something exploded. The candles flickered. Hadrosian nodded. He'd expected this, I realized. He pulled out a data slate and began reading names. 20 names, 20 people who would board the transport. The selection criteria, he explained, were based on seniority, irreplaceability, genetic fitness for void travel, and family connections to administrative officials. He read the list twice, carefully, so there could be no mistakes. My name wasn't on it. The 20 chosen clerks looked at the rest of us. Some faces showed relief, some showed guilt, most showed nothing. We'd all learned long ago to keep our faces blank when the system made its selections. That was what being a good cog meant. You turned when you were supposed to turn. You didn't question the machine. The transport would arrive in 6 hours, Hadrosian said. In that time, we would prepare the priority documents. 800 kilograms represented approximately 19,000 files, carefully selected for maximum administrative continuity. Census records for key tithe sectors, military supply chain documentation, purity certification archives, the essential memory of empire. We knew what to do. We'd trained for this. There were protocols for everything, even apocalypse. We worked. What else could we do? I pulled files from the restricted archives, birth certificates for nobles' children, purity seals for gene stock, criminal records for heretics whose executions needed to be legally documented for audit purposes. My hands moved automatically. Pull folder. Check reference number against manifest. Place in transport crate. Seal. Next folder. The tremor in my hand had stopped. I felt very calm. Clerk Secondary Venn started crying around hour 2. Not loud sobbing, we didn't have energy for that. Just tears running down his face while he worked, dripping onto the folders he was packing. Hadrosian told him to be careful. Salt water could damage the documents. Venn nodded and wiped his face with his sleeve and kept working. The children arrived during hour 3. There were 11 of them, ages maybe 5 to 13, brought down to the archive level by arbitrator Sergeant Kalth. Refugees, he explained, orphaned when their hab block collapsed. He'd found them trying to break into a food distribution center. Normally he would have processed them through the standard channels, orphanage assignment, work detail evaluation, eventual conscription or factory placement, but the standard channels no longer existed. The city was dying. These children were administratively orphaned in an administratively non-existent situation. He wanted to know if they could be added to the transport. Hadrosian did the mathematics on his data slate. 11 children, average mass 40 kilograms each. 440 kilograms total. We would need to remove approximately 10,000 documents. Census records for 2 medium-tier hive sectors, 3 years of supply chain data, the personnel files for an entire administratum sub-department. The regulations were clear. Children without documented parentage or assigned utility designation held minimal administrative value. The documents represented irreplaceable continuity of governance. It wasn't even a choice, really. The choice had been made centuries ago when someone had written the protocols we were following. Hadrosian explained this to Kalth, carefully, patiently. The way you might explain to a particularly slow clerk why Form 88G needed to be filed in triplicate. Kalth looked at the children, looked at us. His face did something complicated. Then it went blank again. He nodded. He understood. He'd been in the Arbeits long enough to understand how the system worked. But he couldn't take them back up. The levels above were burning. The enemy had reached the administratum district. If he took them up, they would die slowly, in fire or under rubble or in the hands of the enemy. If we kept them down here, they would die when the archive's life support failed, probably within 20 hours. Slower, alone in the dark. Unless, Kalth said, someone wanted to solve the problem another way. The children watched us with huge eyes. They didn't speak. They'd learned the way you learn in the lower hive when speaking might get you killed. They just stood there in their ragged clothing covered in dust and blood while we decided their administrative status. Clerk Tertiary Voss volunteered. He was staying anyway, not selected for extraction. He would handle it. Quickly. The incinerators in sub-level 3 were still functional. medical waste disposal. If we logged it properly, there would be no discrepancy in the archive's final mortality records. Hadrosian considered this, checked his data slate, checked the protocols, nodded. Kolth left. He walked fast. He didn't look back. Voss took the children down to sub-level 3. We kept working. Pull folder, check number, pack, seal, next. I could hear my breathing. Could hear everyone's breathing. The archive was very quiet except for the distant sound of the city dying above us. The screaming started maybe 10 minutes later. Not long, just long enough for Voss to have gotten them down there, opened the incinerator, maybe explained what was going to happen. Or maybe he didn't explain. Maybe he just started with the smallest one. I don't know. I didn't go down to check. The screaming lasted 4 minutes. I know because I was watching the chronometer on the wall. 4 minutes, then silence. Then Voss came back up. His hands were shaking, his face was grey. He went back to his desk and resumed packing documents. Nobody spoke to him. Nobody spoke at all. That was when I tasted it. The burnt parchment and rendered fat. It came up through the ventilation system, thin and acrid and sweet. I swallowed bile and kept working. The transport came early. 5 hours and 41 minutes instead of 6. Hadrosian was annoyed. We hadn't finished the full manifest. We were 73 kilograms short of optimal cargo capacity. But the pilot wouldn't wait. The enemy was too close. It was now or never. The 20 chosen clerks boarded. They carried the document crates with them. Careful, reverent. This was the memory of empire they were saving. The genetic records, the tithe assessments, the supply chain data, everything that would let the administratum continue functioning wherever they were going. Whatever came next. Hadrosian was the last to board. He stood at the top of the transport ramp and looked back at us. The 27 clerks staying behind. The ones not genetically fit enough, not senior enough, not connected enough, not essential. He told us we had done our duty. The administratum would remember our sacrifice. It would be logged, documented. Our names would be entered into the roll of honored dead, pending verification and review. In 17 to 30 months, our families might receive death pensions. If our families still existed, if the system survived long enough to process the claims, then the ramp closed, the transport lifted. The concussion from its engines knocked over a shelf of personnel files from the 800s. Paper flew everywhere. We didn't pick it up. We sat in the dark and waited to die. Clerk Primary Hadrosian had left instructions. When the enemy breached the archive, and they would breach it eventually, we were to destroy the remaining documents rather than let them fall into heretical hands. There were incendiary charges placed throughout the archive, fail-safes. A single detonator that would turn 3,000 years of records into ash. He had not left the detonator with us. The enemy came on day 19. We heard them for hours before we saw them. The sound of cutting torches on the archive blast doors. The smell of melting metal. We'd long since stopped working. There was no point. We'd eaten the last of the protein paste. The water had run out. Some of the clerks had tried to reach the upper levels, see if there was any way out. They came back with stories of fires and corpses and enemy soldiers executing anyone they found in administratum uniforms. Better to stay in the archive. Better to die here among the shelves than burned alive or shot in the street. Voss hanged himself on day 18, used his belt and a support beam in the restricted section. We found him in the morning, very still, his face purple-black. We left him there. There was nowhere else to put him. The incinerators had run out of fuel. When the doors finally gave way, I expected soldiers, warriors, the kind of murderous heretics the propaganda posters showed, foaming at the mouth, covered in obscene symbols, radiating wrongness. They looked like us. Tired men and women in mismatched uniforms, scared, hungry, human. They swept through with guns raised, shouting, checking corners. When they realized we weren't armed, weren't resisting, they lowered their weapons. They looked confused. Their commander was a woman maybe 10 years older than me. She had sergeant's insignia I didn't recognize. Their system, their hierarchy equally banal. She asked us who we were, what we did here. Hadrosian's replacement, Clerk Principal Even, promoted by default when Hadrosian left, explained. We were archival staff. This was Administratum Archive Section 47. We maintained the historical records, census data, tithe documentation. We were non-combatants, administrative personnel. The sergeant looked at the shelves stretching into darkness, at the millions of folders and data slates and parchment scrolls. She asked what was in them. Everything, Even said. Births, deaths, taxes, crimes, executions. The daily grinding documentation of how an empire keeps track of its subjects. How it knows who owes what, who lives where, who's pure and who's not. 3,000 years of meticulous record-keeping. The sergeant walked to the nearest shelf, pulled a folder at random. Read it. Her face changed. She pulled another. She started walking faster, pulling files, scanning them, dropping them on the floor. Her soldiers watched her. We watched her. She turned back to us, asked if we knew what was in these files. Of course, Even said. We'd maintain them. That was our job. The sergeant's voice went very quiet, very careful. She asked if we knew what the purity certification files documented, the genetic fitness assessments, the population control records, the elimination orders signed off by administratum officials 3 levels above us, authorizing the culling of unproductive population segments in the lower hive districts. We knew, of course we knew, they were filed in section G447, subcategory Theta, cross-referenced with medical assessment forms and Arbeits execution confirmations. Properly indexed, properly maintained. It was our job to know. Had we ever read them, she asked. Really read them? Why would we? There were 17 million documents. You couldn't read them all. You could only file them, maintain them, preserve them. The system required it. The continuity of governance required it. You couldn't question every piece of paper that crossed your desk. You'd go mad. You'd never finish your work. You just processed what came to you and filed it where it belonged. The sergeant was quiet for a long time. Then she asked about the smell, the sweet acrid smell that still lingered in the ventilation system. Medical waste, Even said. Standard disposal protocols. It had been logged. Sub-level 3 incinerator batch 447G dated 3 days prior. What kind of medical waste? The sergeant asked. Even hesitated, looked at the rest of us. We looked at the floor. The sergeant sent soldiers down to sub-level 3. They came back 10 minutes later. One of them was vomiting, another was crying. The sergeant's face went very still. She asked again what kind of medical waste. Even told her, factually, clinically. 11 orphan children. Administratively non-essential, no transport capacity, standard disposal protocols for biological material that posed a storage and resource problem. It had been logged. The paperwork was in order. The sergeant shot her. Once, sent a mass. Even fell backward into a shelf of personnel files from the 900s. She looked surprised. Blood spread across her grey administratum coat, soaking into the fabric. She tried to speak. Couldn't. Died still looking surprised. The sergeant asked who else had been involved. I raised my hand. Not because I wanted to die, though I did. I realized I wanted to very much. But because the truth seemed important somehow. Because after all the lies we'd wrapped ourselves in, the protocols and procedures and proper channels, the only thing left that mattered was that someone know exactly what we'd done. I told her, not Voss, he was already dead, but the rest of us, how we'd kept working while the children screamed, how we'd prioritized the documents, how we'd calculated the cargo weight and decided that census records for 2 hive sectors outweighed 11 human lives, how we'd followed our training, how we'd done our duty. I told her about the smell, and how I'd kept packing files while it rose through the ventilation, how my hands hadn't shaken, how I'd checked each reference number carefully because the regulations required accuracy, how I'd been proud in some sick, quiet place in my mind that even in crisis we'd maintained proper documentation standards. I told her everything. The other clerks stood silent. Some nodded, confirming. Yes, that was what happened. Yes, we'd known. Yes, we'd participated, if only by continuing to work, by not stopping it, by choosing the system over the screaming. The sergeant listened. When I finished, she was quiet for a very long time. Then she told her soldiers to bring us all outside. They marched us up through the archive levels, through the administratum district. The city was a corpse. Buildings collapsed, streets cratered, bodies everywhere, some in uniform, some civilian, all equally dead. The air was thick with smoke. My eyes watered. I kept walking. They lined us up in what had been a transit plaza, 26 of us, the surviving archival staff of Section 47. They made us kneel. I thought they would shoot us, expected it, wanted it. The sun was setting. The sky was orange and purple with smoke and fire. It was almost beautiful. I thought about how I would be logged somewhere, Clerk Tertiary Designation 447G73, executed by enemy forces during siege operations. Maybe someone would file the paperwork properly. Maybe my death would be documented. The sergeant walked down the line. She stopped in front of each of us, asked the same question. Did you know what you were doing? Everyone said yes. What else could we say? She reached me, asked the question. I said yes, I knew. I understood. I'd chosen the documents over the children because that was what my training told me to do, what the system required, and I had never once in 11 years questioned whether the system itself might be wrong. She asked if I was sorry. I didn't know how to answer that. Sorry seemed too small. Sorry was what you said when you made a filing error or missed a deadline. What I felt was bigger and darker and more complicated. I had genuinely believed I was doing the right thing, necessary thing. The brutal calculus of empire required brutal choices, and someone had to make them, and I had been trained to be the person who made them without flinching. I had been good at my job. I told her that. I told her I didn't know how to be sorry for being what they'd made me. She nodded, like she understood. Then she told us what they were going to do. They weren't going to kill us. Execution was too clean, too quick. We would work instead. They were establishing a new administratum in the city, their version, their system, but still an administratum because no matter who won, empire required paperwork. They needed people who understood filing systems, who could process documents, who could maintain records with meticulous accuracy, but not the old records. Those would burn. The entire archive, all 17 million documents, would be destroyed. The genetic purity files, the elimination orders, the cargo manifest listing human beings like grain shipments, 3,000 years of carefully maintained atrocity would become ash. We would build something new. We would document the reconstruction, log the dead, process the survivors, track the resources, the same skills, the same meticulous attention to detail. But this time, and her voice went very hard here, this time we would remember what we'd done every day, every file we processed, we would carry it. She assigned us to the burial details first. Before we could touch a pen or data slate, we would spend 6 months handling the dead, learning their weight, looking at their faces. The civilians we'd filed away as acceptable losses. The children we'd written off as administratively non-essential. We would carry them, catalog them, bury them. And if we refused, if we tried to escape or end ourselves or simply stop working, she would find us. And she would take us back to sub-level 3, to the incinerators, and she would show us what we'd done to those children. What it really meant, beyond the clinical language of disposal protocols. She would make us understand viscerally, bodily, what we'd participated in. Then she would let us go, and we'd keep working. That was 6 years ago. I'm writing this in a new archive. Smaller, cleaner, The files here document the dead from the siege. 4 million names. I've processed maybe 30,000 myself. I read each one, forced myself to name, age, cause of death, survivors if any. It takes longer this way. It's supposed to. The smell never leaves. The burnt parchment and rendered fat. It's not real. The doctors say it's psychosomatic, that I'm remembering it, not smelling it. But it's there when I wake up. There when I fall asleep. There when I open each new file. The other clerks from Section 47 are scattered through the new administratum. We don't talk. We see each other in corridors, in the meal hall, in the document processing rooms. We look away. There's nothing to say. We know what we are. 3 have killed themselves. 2 more tried and were stopped. The sergeant kept her word, took them back down to what's left of the old archive, to sub-level 3. They came back changed, smaller somehow, broken in a new way. They kept working. I keep working too. What else is there? I'm good at filing, good at maintaining records, good at being the mechanism that turns when it's supposed to turn. I just understand now what I'm part of. The weight of it, the price. Sometimes I think about Hadrosian and the 20 chosen clerks, where they went, what they're doing with the 800 kilograms of priority documents they saved. Building some new archive somewhere probably, training new clerks to maintain the system, passing on the protocols, proper procedure, the regulations that let you incinerate children and call it waste disposal. Sometimes I think about those children. I never learned their names. They weren't logged individually, just processed as a batch. Medical waste, 11 units, 40 kilogram average mass. The paperwork was perfect. The math was correct. Everything was filed properly. The sergeant says that's the point. That's what she wants us to carry. Not just guilt, though there's that, an ocean of it, but knowledge, understanding. The system didn't fail. We didn't make a mistake. The system worked exactly as designed. It produced people who could hear children screaming and keep filing documents, because the documents were more important than the screaming. It produced people who could calculate the weight of lives and find them wanting. It produced us, and we were good at our jobs. That's what I taste in the morning, sharp and sweet on my tongue. That's what the smell means. Not just burnt flesh, not just the specific horror of sub-level 3 on day 16, but the realization that I was exactly what the system needed me to be, efficient, obedient, precise, unable to question whether the thing I served deserved my service. The city is rebuilding, slowly. The new administratum is supposed to be different, better, more humane. The sergeant, she's a governor now, elevated by whoever won the war, their hierarchy equally labyrinthine, says we're establishing new protocols, new regulations, everything will be documented differently. The value calculations will account for human life, not just administrative utility. I want to believe her. I file the forms she gives me. I process the new regulations. I maintain the new records with the same meticulous care I gave the old ones. But late at night, alone in my hab cell, I wonder what I'll do when the system requires another choice, when the mathematics demand another calculation, when someone arrives with children and a cargo weight problem, and the regulations, new regulations, humane regulations, but still regulations, point toward an answer. I wonder if I'll be strong enough to refuse, or if I'll pull out my data slate and start doing the math. I think I know the answer. I taste it every morning. It never washes away. They didn't save the city, they saved the records, and I helped them do it. And somewhere in the universe, in some other archive, on some other world, someone just like me is learning to file documents with perfect precision, learning to serve the system, learning not to hear the screaming. The empire grinds forward. We are its teeth. We chew what it feeds us and never ask what we're eating. That's what I am. That's what I'll always be. The records will remember us as faithful servants. The documents will show we followed protocol. The paperwork will be perfect. Only the smell tells the truth.